Right, ladies and gentlemen, this is my common screws box. These are the screws that I carry around on every job. And the way this has worked, this evolves over time. The particular screws I've got in here, if you looked at this box maybe 2 years ago, you would find it was slightly different to the screws that are in here now. These aren't the only screws I've got. I've got my magic box of screws, which are the most random collection of all sorts of weird shaped things. This very rarely gets taken on jobs unless I've got a particular kind of problem solver job that I need to do. I might show you around this in a future video. I've got a box of like bigger screws and more kind of, you know, your flooring screws and stuff like that. But it tends to be your great big like 6x80mm TurboGold screws and things. For whatever reason, I've got a bunch of Phillips plasterboard screws in there. Just tends to be bigger screws that I keep in this box. Again, I don't take this out of jobs, or very rarely take this out of jobs. I've got a couple of random boxes of TurboGold like screws that I bought on a whim to see if they were any different to normal TurboGold screws, which they're not. I've got loads of these hoarding tubs, and this essentially is where the screw nest ends up in when I decide that I'm not going to bother sorting through my screws, and I'll just put them in a pot where they will probably spend the rest of their lives. I've then got machine screws and washers, little dinky smaller screws and, you know, finer thread screws and whatnot. Cabinet screws and screws really specific to, well, cabinet making. A whole bunch of screws specific to AV installs, putting up TV brackets and things like that. Of course, I've got a whole stock of screws ready to replenish my OCD boxes. And of course, there's a screw nest. But the screws that have ended up in my common screws box it's quite a fluid situation, you know. This has evolved over time and it will continue to evolve over time. And basically what happens is I've got screws that I obviously use like all the time. So this particular bunch of screws in here, which are 3.5x20mm TurboGold screws, I tend to get through quite a lot of those. And I know which ones I'm using all the time, and I know which ones I'm not using all the time. So if I come across a situation where, oh, I could really do with a particular size of screw, well, what I'll do is I'll find the screws that I use least often, they'll get demoted into a different box, and then a different type of screw will end up in one of the sections, and then as long as I'm using those all the time, they will stay in there. So it evolves is what I'm saying. Don't necessarily think that just because these are the screws that I use, it's going to be the same screws that you need to use. A little tip as well, what I do with all of these screws is I always cut out the little bit of cardboard off the screw packet and I shove that in the bottom of the little ducket. And then once I've run out of screws, I know which screws I need to put back in that section. And for the common screws, because I get through so many of these, I always make sure that I've got at least one box of every type of these in stock. And once I've emptied a box that's been stored on the shelf, I buy a new box to replace it. So I've always got the screws that are in here, plus generally a box of each, unless it's a screw that I'm genuinely not using, and then I'll just let that stock kind of naturally run out. So I'll quickly take you through every section, tell you what I've got in each compartment, and then later on I'll tell you why I've got each of these types of screws and what I use them for. So top left up here, I have got EasyDrive flange head screws, 8x1/2 inch. And by the way, everything in here is PoziDriv. Pretty much everything in all of my screw boxes is PoziDriv. I've got the odd box of Torx. I've obviously got Robertson's for my pocket screws, but 99% of the screws I'm using are PoziDriv heads. I find they work absolutely fantastic for the sort of work I do, but obviously that'll vary depending on where you are in the world and if you can actually get hold of PoziDrive screws. But Phillips, bad. PoziDrive, good. There's also a mix of metric and imperial. It's just, in the UK, we're still in that kind of halfway house between metric and imperial, and there's certain types of screws where it's just easier to get hold of the imperial version than it is to get the metric version. For example, it seems to be much easier to get hold of round head screws that are in imperial measurements than it is to get them in metric measurements for some reason. Anyway, flange head, 8x1/2 inch screws in there. I've then got TurboGold self-drilling screws. These are 4x45mm TurboGold self-drilling. Down here we have got QuickSilver 10x3.5 inch wood screws. TurboGold 4x30s. TurboGold 4x45s. GoldScrew 4x50 round head screws. TurboGold 3.5x20s. These are 10x3 inch, I can tell you without even looking at the card. We've then got QuickSilver round head 8x1 inch screws. 10x1 3/4 inch wood screws. We've then got 3.5x16mm gold screws. 4x16mm silver screws. 10 gauge by 4 inch QuickSilver wood screws, and 10x2.5 inch QuickSilver screws as well. All of these QuickSilver ones, they're twin thread, zinc plated, general purpose wood screws. All of these are hardened carbon steel screws. They do not break. So in terms of what I actually use all these different types of screws for, these little flange head screws are really handy to have. These are the little 8x1/2 inch EasyDrive flange head wood screws. They're really useful for like little brackets and things like that. Anything where you need obviously a non-countersunk screw. And they've got a nice wide flat base on them as well. So they give quite a lot of support to whatever you're holding onto the substrate. Really robust. Pozi 2, obviously all of the screws in my common screws box are Pozi 2, by the way. So I only need one type of screwdriver bit for every screw in that box. The TurboGold 4.5x45 screws, these are single thread self-drilling wood screws. Very handy for things like screwing floorboards down and stuff like that. They're a good size for a whole load of different jobs. Zinc and yellow passivate, rifled shank, razor sharp self-drilling tip. I find the 4.5x45s are probably one of the most common screws that I use. Continuing on the TurboGold screws, so again these are all rifled shank with the self-drilling tips on them. We've got the 4x45 and the 4x30. The big difference between these and the 4.5mm ones that I just showed you is that these have quite a significantly smaller head on them, so it's not going to give as much support to whatever you're screwing to the substrate, but there are plenty of situations, especially, you know, putting like mirror brackets up and stuff like that, where you need a screw that's got a smaller head to fit into like a keyhole type slot or whatever. I know you should probably really use a round head screw, but you know, sometimes you can't carry every single type of screw that exists on the planet. These are generally very handy size screws to have anyway. As I say, 4x45s and 4x30s. I've then got the 4x50mm round head gold screws. I must admit I don't use these that often, but I seem to have like millions of them in stock, so I'm trying to get through them. These are quite handy for like picture hanging and again, anything where you need the flat back on the screw as opposed to a countersunk head. So, you know, mirror brackets and that sort of thing. You can imagine if you've got a bracket going into a plug and you've got maybe, let me find an example, pretty bad example here, but just to give you an idea. And if you're putting this into a wall, you've got plenty scope for the screw. As I say, these are a little bit too long, but for what, I can't even remember why I ended up with so many of these, but ideally I would have slightly shorter versions of these. I think Screwfix accidentally sent us like millions of boxes of 50mm gold screws, so I'm just trying to get through them. Probably a bad example. really. I would probably go for 40mm as opposed to 50mm if I was to buy these again. The 50's just a bit on the long side. The little 3.5 by 20mm TurboGold screws, I tend to mainly use those when I'm doing like floating shelf brackets and whatnot, and if I need to attach like one supporting strip onto another bit with a couple of these kind of brackety things. And you can see, I mean, I'm only into an 18mm piece of wood here, but there's no splitting or anything of the wood using the little TurboGolds because they've got the self-drilling tip on them, so even though I'm right at the edge of the piece of wood on a really thin bit of wood, there's no splitting or anything like that. So that's probably the main thing that I use those for. We've then got the GoldScrew 3.5 by 16mm and the SilverScrew 4 by 16mm. Both of these predominantly get used for Euro cabinet hinges into the door side, hence them only being 16mm. Obviously the doors are generally 18mm thick, so you want to make sure that you're not using a screw that's going to pop out the other side. I used to mainly use the 3.5 by 16s, but as you'll have seen on the Test Tuesdays that I did, the 4 by 16s performed significantly better. Both did very well in terms of holding power, but the 4 by 16s did like amazingly well. So now if I'm putting Euro hinges onto doors, I tend to use those and they work really well. We've then got the QuickSilver 8 by 1 inch round head screws, twin thread, general purpose wood screws, great problem solver to have kicking about. We've got the flat back on the round head screws, which makes them really good for attaching like flat brackets into woodwork. You'll have seen on my recent video where I was putting the pull-up bar up. These were the perfect screw for the job, really, for that sort of thing. I then use this range of 10 gauge wood screws ranging from 1 3/4 inch all the way up to 4 inch. As I say again, these are Screwfix QuickSilver screws, twin thread, general purpose wood screws, zinc plated, hardened carbon steel screws, very, very tough screws these. And I predominantly use these for attaching things to walls. I've mentioned it before in earlier videos, but you don't really want to use, if you can avoid it, screws with self-drilling and rifled shanks and that sort of thing. You don't really want to use those if you're going into plastic wall plugs, because it tends to eat away at the plug and it removes quite a lot of material from the plug, which is the exact thing that you don't want to do when you're using plastic wall plugs. So anything that involves wall plugs, I tend to use the non-rifled, non-self-drilling screws. And that's why I've got this range here. So if you imagine everything from your kind of smallest thing that I would be putting on the wall, I'm saying that, I mean, one of those will hold a huge weight. But then it depends on the thickness of the thing that you're attaching to the wall. So obviously for smaller brackets and things, the 1 3/4 inch. If you're getting into the realms of maybe attaching something about the thickness of 20mm or whatever onto the wall, then up to the 2.5 inch. Then if you're getting into bigger stuff, I've got the 3, 3.5 and 4 inch. And with the 4 inch, you could be running 2, maybe 3 plugs back to back, depending on the thickness of the thing that you're attaching onto the wall. But I find the 10 gauge screws work really well with your typical red wall plug. I'll include a link to the Test Tuesday videos that we've done about this. If you're attaching stuff into brick and concrete and that sort of thing with a humble red plug, or if you want to be fancy like the Fisher Duo Power or whatever. Someone asked if you can run the Duo Powers back to back. You can, but you have to kind of really force it into the hole because of this like lip on the end of the plug. So if I'm doing back-to-back plugs, I would tend to use just normal bog standard red plugs. I view the Duo Power as more of a problem solver than anything else. For common use, the normal bog standard red plugs hold such a weight in brick and concrete and things. There's no else you really need, you know. If you can get 300 plus kilos off one screw, axial force, then do you really need more than that for your average situation? But as I say, this kind of range from the 1 3/4 inch up to the 4 inch, I find covers me for most eventualities, from hanging relatively small things on the wall to hanging pretty huge things onto the wall. There you go, folks. I hope you found that useful. It's something that I get asked about in the comments quite often, but hopefully, you know, if you're wanting to just get started doing property maintenance type work and maybe woodworking type work, that might be a bit of a starting point for the sort of screws to get in stock. But as I say, mine has very much evolved over time. Do let us know in the comments below what your preference is for the sort of screws that you carry around all the time. You don't need to tell us literally every type of screw that you ever use, but just in terms of your most common, like top 5 screws or whatever, pop it down in the comments below. And also let us know whereabouts in the world you are as well, because it's always interesting to know the sort of screws that get used depending on what country you're in. The main reason, as I say, that we use PoziDriv over here is that it's the most freely available screw there is. They work really, really well, way better than Phillips. If, as I say, Phillips free zone in this workshop. If I find a Phillips screw, it goes straight in the bin. I'm still trying to eradicate them. The odd one creeps in every now and then, but I feel like I'm winning the battle. I'm not going to talk about brands of screws in this video because it's already getting quite long. I'll save that for a future video. All I would say really, I'm using Screwfix screws and they're absolutely fine. I've never had a screw break when using it in a kind of reasonable way. You use whatever screw brand you want to use as long as it's a decent brand, and if you find that they're breaking or anything, switch to a different brand. I've never had that problem with Screwfix screws. I do seem to have built up an excessive stock of screws, so I'm going to run a bit of a giveaway soon on this channel, so make sure you're subscribed. I'll keep you posted of that over the next couple of months, but I've got a lot of screws that I don't really need, so I might as well try and give them a good home. Anyway, as per usual, take care folks. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.